So we're going to begin by modeling a roof tile, one that we can transfer over and use over and over. So I'm going to add in the tube object, and I also want to add in a camera and set the view to the back. So this tube does need to be changed to the Z. Actually, we can set it to the Y. And then we'll just switch out of the camera and go ahead and start to model this out. Can scale it down in the model mode using the scale tool. And we're going to adjust the height. And then set up a slice. So we're going to do -90 to 90. And we're going to see how that's going to look from the camera. Actually, it looks like 0 to 180 is actually going to work best for our view. So we'll go ahead and keep with that. We don't really need to worry about the overall amount of polygons because we're just going to be rendering out the image. So the more polygons the better, because the better the image and the texture is going to look. We can set up fillet for the edges. The slice will not take that into account, so we can do that manually if needed. And we'll go ahead and increase the height a little bit more. That should work pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and we will use 36 for the rotation segments. I'm going to switch over to line mode. Go to our slice. And I was hoping to get rid of those n-gons. We won't be able to, except manually. So what I'm going to do is hit C on the keyboard and make this editable. We're going to switch over to the top view, and we're going to switch to the rectangular selection tool, going over to the polygon mode, turning off the only select visible elements, and selecting, actually we can select both of these at the same time, and hit UZ on the keyboard, which is going to take a look. Pressing U, we can see Z is the melt tool, and we shouldn't have any extra points in there, so that's not going to be a problem. I didn't add any segments up and down. I don't think that's really going to impact it that much because we're going to have just a very slight change in the top of the model of the scale. One thing I want to do is, with these polygons still selected, hit M and then S for bevel. We're just going to bevel this edge out. Not much, just enough to pick up a highlight. That should actually be good, just a small extrusion. And then going back to the rectangular selection, we're going to select at the top. We can switch to the camera view. Go ahead and hit scale. We're just going to scale that down a little bit. And then we're going to go ahead and just move that up. And if we need to, probably want to modify the object axis. So where it is right now looks alright. I think I am going to apply a little bit of rotation to the actual model, not the object axis. And what we want to do is just overlay these on top of each other. I'm going to go ahead and grab that object axis and maybe bring it up and in a little bit, make it a little easier to edit. And rotate it with our cloners. So now we can switch over to the camera view, turn off the wireframe view, and because we are basically faking the look of the 3D, and we're not going to be able to really look at it from every different angle, and we want to keep a minimal amount of geometry, we need to embellish certain parts of the model. So rotating it up to see some of those edges can be helpful. Now that I'm looking at this, it may not be thick enough. So I'm going to get out of the camera mode really quick and just take a look and see if we can quickly switch over to the polygon mode and select the inner polygons. And I'm just going to scale these in just a little. That'll give us a nice little bit of variation there. I'm going to go back to the model mode, switch to the camera, and now we're going to add in a cloner object to clone these. We're going to be creating a couple of different cloners. So we open up the MoGraph menu, and we're going to add in a cloner, add that tube object. And the linear mode is what we want to use. And we want to set our spacing a little bit higher. Obviously, I'm not working in real-world scale. You could really see how large the output is, which is quite high. So what we can do is adjust the amount per step, how much we want them to overlap. And then I do want to go over to the Transform tab, and we can modify the pitch. So now if we wanted to pick these up, or go from a different angle, make any sort of adjustments, we can do that pretty easily. I do want, like I said, to somewhat add a little bit of an angle, just because we're not going to be able to see that shape otherwise. Now we don't want to do it too much, but just enough to pick up the highlight. And then I'm also going to set a color, just kind of a tannish brown color to start with. And that is going to be one strip of tiles. So the next we're going to have, we're going to copy and paste this cloner object, and I am going to rotate this around. Rotate the heading 180 degrees. And this is interlocking type tile, so you'll have some laid down upside down, and then the other one's laying on top of it. And we will need to modify the pitch to get that to look correct from this angle. So we can basically reverse it. And then if we need to modify the position a little, we can just pull that back. For the Z, just moving it behind, so that's not intersecting. And then we're going to be cloning these two. I'm also going to have another duplicate of this first one, so I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this, and we can just hide it for right now. This one's going to take care of the end tile. So we're going to add one more cloner. And we're going to add the other cloners to it. And we need to modify the position to go on the X. We're going to turn off the fixed clone. And then we're going to just set that amount so that we have the tiles overlapping. Looks like maybe in this case we might have to have two separate sets. I think what we can do is change this over to the cluster mode, and then now we have it filled in. So we'll just modify, and I am going to switch over to the enhanced OpenGL so it can handle the geometry a lot better. And just set our spacing so that it is equal. So we might need to just kind of tweak it until we get to a point where it's going to look good. I'm going to start just reducing the amount of instances so this has a little better response time. And once that looks correct for the overlapping, we can just increase the count. To fill the amount of space we need. So then if we need to raise this up any higher, maybe get more tiles out of it, if we had a much larger roof space we wanted to work with, we can go into the cloner object and increase the count. So I could set this to 20. And then we need to go into the other tile layer and also set that. Then we can go to the main cloner, increase that tile amount. And that should actually work really well with the way that's set up. So we also need to go to that first one, the one I separated, set that one to 20 as well, and we're going to modify the model and move it to cover up the end. Now the color is appearing a little differently because the color is overlapping between the objects. So what I want to do is take that main cloner object and change the color to white. Or we might be able to just control all of the colors with that main cloner. So I will just start all of them with white, actually, except the separated one, because I can copy that color, go over to the cloner, the top cloner, and paste. So that way everything's equal. Just need to make sure that any shaders we set up to modify the color are going to modify this separate object as well. Just makes it a little bit easier to cover up that end. Otherwise what we could do is just crop it from the sides. And there's different ways we can deal with that. So I just saved this file as a tile builder, or tiles builder. I like to add builder to a lot of my different texture creation 3D models, just so I can use them later. What we're going to do right now is randomize the tiles a little bit. Right now they're all identical and a little too perfect. So we do want to add a bit of unevenness to them. And what we need to do is use the bottom level cloners to do this. Because we don't want to modify the entire strip, just the individual clones. So we're going to be adding a random effector just to modify some simple vectors. So we're going to select all of the cloners, including that side strip we're going to add in a random effector, which is going to be automatically added to the list. And if we go over to the parameters tab, first I'm going to start by just turning off the position. I'll go ahead and change my panels here so you can see that a little better. What I want to do is change the rotation a little. Something very slight. We don't want to modify this too much. If I set it to 25, you can see there's a lot of variation, which might be way too much. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 5. Pitch and bank, probably -2 and 2, maybe 2 and 2. Go over to the effector tab. Under the min max, set the minimum to 0, and maybe -50. We just don't want too much overlapping. We can also reduce the impact. Index mode is going to apply that random rotation to the individual nodes rather than a kind of overall value. It provides more variation. We don't necessarily need to do that. We can switch to, say, a noise, modify animation speed, set to 0, and then the scale. Now we'll go ahead and change the scale to maybe 15 to add more variation throughout. What we could also do is we want to offset maybe the position a little bit. So we turn on position, and we don't want 50. So we'll start with 0 for everything, and then just kind of take a look, adding values to see which is going to really work out best for each direction. Keeping in mind that we don't want to go too far off, because we don't want things intersecting to the point of them making not really look real. But we can still create some nice modifications to vary the position overall and make it look a little more realistic. So that way it's not perfect. Perfection is not exactly what we want. We want it to look real. And things that are real are not perfect. So now if I turn on the scale, we can also set up a little bit of a scale change per object. Just a little bit. We don't want too much of a scale change, but it does add a nice variation. So other than that, unless you wanted to add some cracked tiles in there or something like that, that would be best done by modifying the tube object and maybe changing the polygons. One thing I want to do is reduce the Phong angles to, say, 35. It should give us a nicer edge on the front, making sure we also do that for that side stripped object. So go ahead and save this, and we're going to move on to modifying color. In order to be able to render quick color variations, it's a good idea to make sure that you don't have the effector chosen for the color. Also modifying position, rotation, or scale. So the random effector we wouldn't want to use because we can't just modify the color independently. We also have to modify the scale and position. And I just want to reduce the amount of images really needed, so we could use the same normal map, same diffusion, but have different color variations. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in another random effector, and we're going to select the cloner objects, same as before, add in a random effector, turn off the position, we're going to turn on the color mode, and we're going to set this up to a color mode. Instead of just turning it on, set it to user defined. That way we can pick a color we want to mix. And then we can set our blending mode. What I also want to do is go to the effector tab and select turbulence, we have it set to global, 0 for the animation speed. Also going back to parameter and turning on the use alpha strength, and now we can see that variation showing up throughout. And then we can pick the mode we want to use. Getting a lot of different color variations depending on the look. If we go to the Effector tab, we can set up the minimum and maximum amount of color change based on this effector. And then we can modify the scale to really change that. So if I was going to animate the color change, so just rendering out the color pass from the multipass and not worrying about anything else because it will go a lot quicker, then I would turn on the animation speed and we can just render out some frames to have a MoGraph shader, the MoGraph multi-shader, connected to the colors and the different changes. Now, this is very monochromatic at the moment, so I also want to add in a shader effector. Another parameter, actually. Before I add that in, I'm going to go back and select those cloners. And in this case, I only want to apply to one of them. So let's use the bottom level ones. So the ones on the bottom, we're going to select that cloner object, which is cloner object 0.1, and we're going to select to add in a shader effector, turn off any modifications in the transform. For the color mode, we're going to turn it to user defined, and then under shading, we're going to select noise, and we're going to switch this over to the world coordinate system, decrease our global scale to 25, increase contrast. We could also remove some of the other vectors, so if we just wanted it to modify on the X, we could set it to, let's say, 50 on the X, and that applies a nice overall change with 0 on the Y and the Z. And then under parameter, we can choose how we want to modify this. We want to use the alpha strength, and I'm going to gray this out a bit and add or subtract, use multiply, divide, really anything that's going to give you what you want to look. I'm going to stick with default and just have a grayer surface to apply over it. So it's darker, dingier, and just modify the minimum and maximum values to fit a little bit better. So this can also be animated for the color variation. In this case, what I would want to do is go to the noise and animate the seed, just applying a couple of keyframes. That would work quite well. Okay, so only one or two more things before we can render this out. What we want to do is set up our render settings. I'm going to set my output to square. So let's go ahead and render this at 1500 by 1500. So this will be able to zoom into and create a larger image output. And anti-aliasing, we're going to set this to best. Let's go ahead and do 2x4. And we're going to add in ambient occlusion to the multipass and also, of course, to the main effects. So I'm going to change my samples to, say, 16, 10 minimum, 16 max. It should be a bit grainy, which is what I want. It could give us a nice overall look. You can turn on the multipass, and I am going to add the material color to the multipass, also the material normal, and we already have the ambient occlusion, and I don't think we really need anything else. We don't have any changes in the specular on the object, so those won't really show up as anything. If you want to use the output, you can also add the RGBA image. And we're also going to be setting up some object buffers in order to create some alphas so that we can control and cut out the objects a little bit easier. And I'm just going to be cropping this in Photoshop so I can give myself a little leeway on the edges. We're going to go over to just collapse these really quick. And we don't have a light in the scene, so it will automatically use the default light. Because the passes that we're using don't really need any sort of lighting, we can just kind of set something up that maybe we would want it to look like with that full color. So I'm just going to pick up the default light, and to access that, if you don't know how, you can go to Display, Default Light, and it'll pull up that panel. I just keep mine open, easier to access. We don't need to have shadows because we have the ambient occlusion. And now this is going to render like this as our color. Let's go ahead and set up our object buffers. So depending on how you want to separate this, I'm going to create 3 object buffers. So we have a couple of different objects. We have the behind object, which is those tiles behind, the ones that we lightened up, and the underlying layer. We're going to right click, Cinema 4D tags, compositing, and make that buffer 1. The next set, or the next tag we want to use, is the upper level and the top level tiles. So we're going to add compositing buffer 2. Now because the end tile strip is also part of that set, we're also going to add that to buffer 2. And then we're going to go through and add each one additionally to buffer 3. So that way we also have one overall alpha to cut it all out, in case we want to use this with some texture editing and cut anything out if needed. So since that's pretty much ready to go, just save it really quick, and now we can render it out. And I did go ahead and cancel that because there is one thing I forgot. If you take a look at the material single pass layer and look at the normal, it is not anti-aliased. I also forgot to add the object buffers to the render settings. So under anti-aliasing, we're going to turn on consider multipasses. Also under multipass, we need to add object buffers. We're going to add 3, and then we need to set each one, so group 2, group 3, and we also have group 1. So 1, 2, and 3, and that will all be rendered, and now we'll be able to render this out anti-aliased for the material normal, which is really important, because otherwise it's going to be really, really jagged. So it does look a bit better. And it doesn't really look like the material normal was or is being anti-aliased, so we might just need to do a little bit of post on that to remove that jagged edge. Otherwise it might turn out alright. We'll just let it finish rendering. The settings I have set right now are kind of high, mainly because of the ambient occlusion and the anti-aliasing overall. So this could take a little bit to render. It shouldn't be too bad though. Okay, so that has finished rendering. What I'm going to do is making sure that the layer is set to image and not single pass, selecting the image and going to save as, making sure that layers is selected and that the alpha channel is turned on, and then we can save that out. And I suggest creating a folder called text to save the textures in if you're going to be using them within that same main folder or directory, because that's where all of your textures are going to be referenced from. So we can call this roof tiles, and I'll just call it 01. we can save that. Now, if we want to generate different color variations, because the cloner object is part of this scene and it's not going to be part of the texture, we do have to render out from here. And what we can do to really make it go much faster is turn off the ambient occlusion, and we don't need any of the object buffers. All we need is just the material color. So what we can do is go in to whatever is affecting our color, which is these top two vectors, and we're going to go over in the random effector. We can modify the scale, change the scale a little bit, go to the shader effector, go to noise, and modify the seed. So then when we render it, it's going to go much quicker, and all we have, or all we really need, is just that single pass, and that rendered in 7 seconds as opposed to the 4.5 minutes it took before to render because of the ambient occlusion, and then rendering the additional material layers. So this is our single pass. So if we were setting up an animation to render out multiple variations, if you're really going to create a gigantic scene that's with a lot of animation, camera animation over the rooftops, so it's going to be really important to have lots of textures and different colors to choose from, then you would want to save this out, your multipass images, as a sequence, and then load the main image starting of the sequence into the multi-shader as shown previously in the training in the city generation section as shown, where you can convert it to layers and it'll take all of the different animation steps and create layers from that. So I'm just going to save out just this one other pass. Just call it color 2. And I'm just going to save another version of the scene. And we're going to start with a new scene. And we're going to take our texture and drag it in. And mostly the normal is going to show up first because the ambient occlusion layer is on top of the normal and is blended. So that's going to show the normal underneath it. What we need to do is I could just minimize the MoGraph menu. We're going to go ahead and open up the material editor. I also want to have an object to add this to, so let's go ahead and add in a pyramid. Then we'll do just a square kind of rooftop. And we'll rename this roof, drag it on top, and we will need to modify the UV in order to match because I did not crop it. We could either just crop out the image in Photoshop or keep it the way it is in order to preserve those edges in case we ever wanted to use this to overlay on top of other material surfaces, and that way you have that information still in the image. So it'd be very easy to just change our UV map. So first what we need to do is set how many segments we want. We could increase the amount of segments, but for this type of object, it's not going to be very helpful. So we'll set it to 1 for our segment. We're going to hit C on the keyboard to make it editable. We're going to switch over to a UV editor. And we're going to switch over to UV polygons. And we can show the texture in the back. It doesn't look like I have it loaded in, so I would have to open that texture. But what I'm going to do is just look at the viewport, so that'll work a little bit easier. So in that polygon mode, we're going to switch over to the rectangular selection. Under the attributes, turn off only visible. Select all of the polygons, and then just switch over to the scale tool, and we can just size these to the position or scale we need. Then switch back to just our regular layout, and we can go to the model mode and now modify in the material editor this material. So we're going to start by copying the channel or the texture that's on the color and pasting it on diffusion, turning that on, going to the normal, pasting that in. So we'll start with the color. We're going to select that color layer, material color. We're going to go over to the diffusion, and we're going to select the ambient occlusion layer. And I want this to be enhanced OpenGL. And now we need to modify the normal. So we're going to select the normal. And then we also want to have something better to judge the lighting. So we may need to flip around some of the texture channels. It looks like the red needs to be switched. So we go to the normal, flip around the red, and just check the Y. And it's really going to depend on what direction we rendered from. Now I rendered with the back view. And the reason for that is if you rendered from the front view, the blue channel needs to be inverted. And in case you don't have access to Photoshop, inverting that channel could be difficult without an image editing program. So this way what we can do is still invert our red and green, but the blue shows up correctly for the tangent. And just having the red flipped looks like it is what we need. If we need to see a high resolution, we can go to the editor and turn up that texture resolution. See it a little bit crisper. So you can see that it appears to have a higher amount of geometry. It looks pretty good overall. Of course, we need to add some additional elements in order to take care of the edges. Also modifying some of the individual channels will improve the quality. If we go over to the diffusion where we have the ambient occlusion layer, I do want to modify, and we can darken that. Because it is pretty light. We do want a little more diffusion. And then make it a little higher contrast if needed, or expand the overall diffusion. We can also adjust the exposure to make it a higher contrast. So a lot of things we can modify with that. Or we can go to Photoshop, make changes that way. So now what I want to do is use the atom object. The atom object can be found within where the array is. We can add the atom array. Also, I've just got it pulled out in my main interface. Also, the advanced atom array, which is a free plugin available. There are links included to this. With the training, you'll find the links. Very useful for a lot of different reasons. I'm going to stick with the basic, just the Cinema 4D atom array to begin with. What I'm going to do is select the pyramid and create an instance object, and then drag that instance into the atom array. And that way, it preserves the current texture on the object, and the object itself, because whatever's in there will disappear. So if I was to just drag in the object, we can see we don't see the pyramid anymore, or the rooftop. So using an instance of the pyramid works quite well. Just need to make sure you group these together. You can just select them both, Alt-G to create a null object. And that way you can move the roof and the atom array together. So we need to make a few changes. We're going to make the sphere radius equal to the cylinder. And then we can modify the amount of subdivisions. And what I want to do is create a texture then to apply to this atom array. For that, what I'm going to do is go over to Photoshop and take the roof tiles and create a new version of this. So under the history, you can select new document, current state, and we're just going to crop out a set of tiles for the strip. And because I don't always want to make the atom array editable, by cropping it out, we don't have to modify the UV, which is only possible when it's already saved out, made into an object. So we'll just go ahead and crop this just underneath that other object, just to have something behind it. And then we can bring in the sides maybe a little. Depending, this is going to wrap around. I'll see how it looks like this first, and if I need to, I'll go back and crop that in even further. But otherwise I want to try to leave it open. So we're going to crop it, and then we're going to save it as a new texture. And I'm going to call this tile strip. Save that out as a TIFF file. And now we have that tile strip. And we can drag it in and apply the same operations as we did with the roof. So going to the color, copy, paste onto the diffusion, paste onto the normal. Under the normal, selecting the material normal, going back, flipping the red. Under diffusion, selecting the ambient occlusion, increasing the black point, 0.4, going to the color, and then selecting the material color. And then we're going to apply that to the atom array. And we may need to increase tiling. There is a bit of rotation that is applied, which is why I wasn't sure how it was going to look until I really got it in there, because we can see where that seam is. It doesn't really look right on that side. We can increase the X tiling to wrap around the object, but it really looks like it's going to need it to be cropped in further, unless you like the way this looks, which is kind of interesting having it multiplied. It is wrapping around the cylinder, so we have 3 copies of this going around this object. So we're going to go back into Photoshop and crop it further. Go back to the crop tool, C on the keyboard is what I'm using, or you can go up here to the tool palette and select cropped, or crop. And we can drag that in. And because this is already rounded, we really don't need a lot of the side detail. So that should work out pretty well. Go ahead and crop it, save it, go back into Cinema, and we want to select and reload the image. And we might need to do that for each of the different textures, and normally it'll apply to all of them, but just to make sure. Okay, so now we can go ahead and set the tiles on the X to 1, and we still have a little bit of that overlap or strange connection. Might be able to go and to the texture tag and turn off use UVW for bump, which is going to basically add a seam to the edge, but it looks like it still really didn't work. Another thing is it might be facing another direction, as you can see, as it's running up and down, facing in different directions depending on the tile. From far away it would work, close up, not perfect. So what we can do, turn tiling back on, use UVW for bump, reduce the X tile to 0.2, and maybe offset the X a little bit. It might start to overlap on other textures or other strips of tiles, but it should work for the most part to make it look pretty decent. So I also want to go ahead and go to the light, go to shadow, set it to just ray traced, so we can start to see a little bit better how it's really going to look. And we can still modify scales if needed on the atom array. Sphere is going to determine the max radius that the cylinder can reach. So sometimes you'll have to set the sphere first, or you will have to set the sphere first and then the cylinder. We could also do single elements. And that will create individual objects. Maybe I'll go ahead and take this light, switch it over to a soft shadow map. And if you're not just getting the detail you want out of this, one thing you can do is, if you go into Photoshop, you can take a look and see if the ambient occlusion layer will be enough to create a bump map. It's kind of grainy, but otherwise what you can do is go to the material normal and select the green or the blue channel to create a bump map. Looks like the blue channel would probably work best. So you could just Control A to select all, Control C to copy with that blue channel. Go back to the RGB and then paste in the new layer, and we'll just call this bump. You can save that out. Go back to our tile strip. Maybe turn off the normal. Turn on the bump. Copy. Paste. And then select the bump. Because this is really already round, it doesn't really need to have any sort of normal attached to it. So the bump might actually work out okay. Otherwise, you could use the bump in combination with the normal set to a very low strength, say 25. Otherwise, bake out the objects and separate them and modify their UV. But we can still go into this roof if we wanted to and select the top point and modify the shape of it. But overall, these tiles look much better than the tiles that you could create in a 2D program. I also want to show you some other ways we can use these passes to make it more interesting. Starting with adding in kind of a mix. So what I'm going to do is get one of my textures that I want to use to mix along with that tile. You could also mix a procedural with it, but I'm going to use a texture. So I'm going to take one of my stone materials from the Archie Textures texture collection from Azul Effects, and stone number 26. We'll go ahead and copy it from the roof, go to the color, and opening up the material editor, we're going to go ahead and set it to fusion, and then we can paste that color on top to blend it, and then we can pick how we want to mix these. Now, because we have those buffers, we can create a much better looking material by cutting this out and not having it overlap. So what we can do is use a mask, and the mask channel we can copy and paste from the roof tiles and select one of our alpha channels. And do want to use the other buffer, buffer 2. So that's going to go on the top tiles. And then I've just loaded in a concrete surface from the Archie Textures collection. Number 10, concrete, copy, go over to the color of the roof. And then for the base channel, which is just the roof tiles, we're going to turn that into a fusion. And then we can paste onto the blend channel. And I have this set to soft light, and we're going to use a mask, copy, paste, and then select alpha channel, object buffer 1. And now we have a much nicer looking texture, something that looks a little more realistic. I do want to modify the lighting a little. So we can see it from the side. Another thing we could do, which is pretty cool, is to take, and I'm going to go ahead and use that concrete material, and just drag it on top of the pyramid object. And what I want to do in the material editor is go from the roof object go to the diffusion, we can copy the ambient occlusion layer, go to the material for the concrete, turn on the alpha, and paste in that ambient occlusion. Invert it if you just want to cover a smaller area. We can use the soft mode if needed. And that creates a nice kind of overlay to fill in some of the different areas. Soft, it does work a little bit better. Maybe increasing contrast or decreasing. And you can see we can get some pretty interesting blends that way. So I want to show you another roof type I made that looks a lot better than this one. I'll go ahead and load in first the texture builder. So this is the texture builder. What I've got is some tiles on the bottom, and then an area set up where I turned them to face the camera directly, and rotated them to plan out geometry. Same thing with the bottom tile strip. And then I've just got tiles generated using MoGraph, same technique I just showed you, for the main tiles in the center. A little bit of a strip separator, and then that top tile strip. So went ahead, rendered that out. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the object I applied it to. So this is the rooftop with the applied texture. And I'm using the same method that I just showed you with the ambient occlusion to blend another material on the top. But we can see the tiles along the bottom, the ones that are going to face a little bit more. And there's a really nice variation in the way it looks. And by using a different specular value and specular width between the roof texture and then the overlaid texture with the ambient occlusion alpha, it really picks up highlights very nicely. And looks like it has a lot of geometry when it's actually very simple. So the way I created this from that texture was I started with a box or a cube, and then went ahead and scaled it down. And it is one side at a time, so I did end up using a symmetry object. Go ahead and drag the material onto that. And you can see after I set up the normal maps and all of that, how it is applied. What I then did was made the object editable. C, so make editable, and bake to polygons. Just going to scale this down just a little. And then K on the keyboard to pull up the knife tool. So I'm going to set that to plane, the plane mode. Right now we're on XY. And I went around to everywhere where there was a separation and knifed it. So anywhere there would be a direction change, I added some cuts. Also in the other direction, in the YZ, coming in on the sides, and then to start, I went round with the edges. And then on the other side, selecting basically the same edges. And just move them down. And then for this front piece, just grabbing the edge of these first two, moving them down, pulling it in a little bit, and that way we have that directional change. And then for the other parts of the object, just selecting, and I'm going to go over to the rectangular selection, grab those edges, and just pull them up, and pull them in. And then going to the other edges and the inside, and pulling that up. Making a few modifications here and there. Adding more knife cuts as needed. And then just built it up until I matched the texture until it looked like it was the right geometry. If we take a look, you can see I also added some additional cuts in order to make the tiles and the front pieces disappear when you're looking at it from the back. So that way, because you wouldn't really see those from behind, you would from the front. So by giving yourself a pretty versatile texture to begin with, you can model pretty simple objects to match it. And because it's already 3D to begin with, when you rendered out the multipass, it looks very realistic. And you can see without that overlay on the other side, it just needs that tile strip needs to be sliced or cut and then kind of pulled out a bit. But it looks really good, and it looks like you know, a couple 100,000 polygons or a couple thousand polygons rather than looking like a flat box.